and one to ask and one to discuss, so like bear with me. But this is a topic near and dear to my heart, and that obviously you guys struggle with, I struggle with, our whole generation struggles with. And I think even more so because of how messed up Western culture has gotten, and I don't mean to make everything about how dumb modern culture is, but I do think it's pretty dumb. In this whole, like, you are what you feel, or like whatever you identify as, and I'm not pulling a political plug, I mean this in an objective sense, where there's some small t truth to that, but divorcing the subjective from the objective makes everything meaninless. Right, and I think that's the issue. So that's why I think the starting point was the spiritual struggle about who is God, and God in this age. And so I wanted to frame this through actually the life of Moses, because, and especially the early life of Moses, because I think where Moses was at when he encounters God is where a lot of us are. So we're not actually, before I even say that, like even the word psychology, right? Like people sometimes are like, oh, do you believe in psychology? Which is a really dumb question, no offense. If you understand the word psychology, what is psychology mean? The study of what? Ology meaning study of. What is psyche? That's what it's being socially called, but it is that. What's another word for it? What is it, psyche? The soul, right? Which is also called the nous, or the mind, in some patristic liturgy, which is why he said that, right? And so, if you're studying the soul, I'm like, the real question to me is, how can a psychologist not believe in God? Right? Because you're acknowledging the existence of something, some aspect of being, right? That is in the government of the immaterial. Right? Like nobody can touch or feel or play with a cute little soul, right? Like there's something else, right? And so psychology, so studying what is healthy for one's spirit only can make sense if there is such thing as a healthy spirit, right? So that's what I mean is like once you divorce something from the objective, it's just randomness, okay? So if we get into Moses, I want to understand in terms of narratives, because everybody today is all about storytelling, right? What's your story? What's your narrative? Or said differently, what's your truth? Whatever that means. But when we make truths, right, or manufacture truths, which might have elements of actual truth to them, right? We sometimes forget that we're plugged into a greater story, right? And I think our generation more than others completely ignore history, and we're rewriting history. I was thinking recently, everyone gets mad and when they read, like 2 weeks ago, they're reading the story of Saint Theophilus, and they destroyed the pagan temples. I'm like, oh, so it's kind of like when they're taking down towers of Lincoln and Washington, right? We're doing the exact same thing all over again, right? Like there's nothing new. Whereas they were part of a history, they're part of a story, they're part of a context, they come from somewhere. And so the narrative, the story of Moses, the reason I'm starting with narrative is saying that Moses comes after who? Joseph, right? There's a gap in history, right? Where the narrative of Genesis leaves off with the Israelites, the chosen people of God, find themselves in Egypt, right? And because of how big of a deal Joseph was, right, they're cared for, they have some prominence, they have their provisions, they have everything. But the narrative of Moses starts with, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Okay, that we're starting like, forget that narrative, right? Like we're entering a place where that is blotted from memory. The issue is that you can't erase the link, right, to the people of Israel. So it's like, well, how did we even end up in Egypt, right? There's a story behind that. There's a narrative, right, that brought them there. And so, you know the story, it says, behold, the sons of Israel, they're too many for us. They're like, you know what, we have this ethnic group here, right? In the Egyptian narrative, right? Of being like that they're gonna be a problem if they keep growing. So let's do population control. Let's kill them. Otherwise, they'll take us over in our own land, right? So you guys know the story. They issue a decree, and then there's like some midwives that are like, they ended up liking the Jews, so they weren't killing them enough, and then there was pressure, etc. And so they start like pushing this law, and then you've got the mother of Moses, who I think her name is Yoshebed, at least in the Ten Commandments movie, that was her name. And so she's concerned, puts her baby in a basket, sends her daughter to follow it in through the reeds, right? And winds up with who? Pharaoh's daughter, right? Now, you got narrative meets narrative, right? You got, here's this culture. So this is actually probably relatable to all but 4 people here. One of them, my new friend Jared. In the sense of that many of you, I mean, actually even Jared and Miriam, and Mark's not really white, and Neil. I mean, they were immigrants here at some point too, right? What I was saying is that here's an immigrant group that went to a place that has a history, that has a story, right? And now his world is about to collide with a whole other narrative, right? Because now he's going to be brought into Pharaoh's house, right? And in Pharaoh's house, completely different religion, completely different culture, right? They don't do the same things. And he was cross-pollinated, if you will, because Miriam, his sister, who is there, because she witnessed it, Pharaoh's daughter allowed her to take Moses to his mother to be nourished for a bit, right? So this makes Moses aware that he's a Jew, right? So Moses grows up knowing that he is one, but it's just a name, it seems, for him, right? Like, which is, I think, common to many people here, right? Which is like, okay, yeah, every culture does religion, like the Egyptians do like Seth and Horus and all them, right? And then like they don't even have a name for God yet, which is part of the story. And then you got people in Israel who just are like the God of our fathers, right? The God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They don't even know what to call it. So it's like, yeah, whatever. You say potato, I say potato, right? And it's chill in the palace, right? But I would imagine that even in the palace, I don't know, they probably didn't like him that much because he's not really ethnically Egyptian, right? So to them, it's just kind of like, yeah, we took him in, but I don't know that he was actually that comfortable, right? Which it doesn't seem to be because of the contention, the strong contention he'll have later on. So Moses does his thing. Sorry, I'm skipping over here to when Moses messes up. So one day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people, so he's identifying them as his people, or so it seems, and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people, right? So here's suddenly, which is so cliche 21st century America, where we're, like, out of nowhere, he's identifying as a Jew. And I'm like, bro, you're not even living like them, right? Like, which is why, like, to them, I'd be like, Smaladi guy, like, you live in a palace, right? We're slaves. But he's worked up, really worked up, and he kills the Egyptian, right? Many of our great prophets started off with big mess-ups, right? So Moses' moment of crisis is he's murdered, right? And it's funny because it's potentially funny because I don't actually know. I speculate that not all Jews would have been even excited that he did it, right? Some of them are like, great, you're going to make our life worse. Now they're going to punish us harder. Others might be like, who do you think you are? Like, what's this fake solidarity? Solidarity for what, right? And then there might have been some that like, oh yes, finally, right? Like somebody standing up and doing something. At any rate, Moses' reaction is like, I don't know what to do, right? So Moses besounces, right? Because he's petrified, like who's going to find out, what's going to be said, what are they going to do to me? So he makes like a tree and leaves. So Moses flees from Pharaoh, and goes to the land of Midian, and he's now exposed to culture number 3, because he ends up helping out Jethro, who's some random priest, we don't know of what, right? His daughter, he gets impressed, they bring him in. I mean, the guy's clearly religious, he's a priest, right? And Moses is now doing the shepherding gig, right? So from baby in a basket to some fake kind of royalty by association, right? To then murderer, to now son-in-law, to a random priest, right? So you've got this complete mix of religion and culture and ethnicities and way of lives and way of thinkings, right? And for Moses, it doesn't seem like any of it meant that much. Moses is basically just living, like I think many of us are, reacting, right? What do I want right now, right? Like what's good for me right now, in my opinion of whatever good is, right? So it might be the emotional rage at some point, the sexual urges at another point, the settle and have a family at another point, but they're all random, right? And I'm using the word random, not spontaneous. They're two different things, right? Spontaneity can be fine. Randomness, not so fine. That's where I think most of us are, right? Is that most of us have grown up and it's just like, yeah, and then we'll wear the ethnic badge when it's cool, right? Of being like, yeah, like I remember when Black Lives Matter started to be a thing, when I noticed more Egyptians identifying as visible minorities than before, where I'm like, really? Suddenly you're really excited, like maybe you are, but like you're really suddenly excited about it. Right? And so just being like, yes, I can so relate as a visible minority. I can definitely speak to that. It touches me right here. I'm like, really? I don't know. If it did, cool. Like if that's your truth. Whereas but the timing of it, right? Where it's like, okay, now it's cool. Whereas when the church was burnt in Vancouver, some people wore the Coptic badge with pride. I was like, yes. We are the persecuted Christians of Egypt, and they were ready to use the word Christian, right? But when the Supreme Court ruled on abortion, I'm not like that, right? And then suddenly it was my Christian badge can go in my pocket, right? And now it's like, no, I'm one of you. I mean, my parents are from there. Yeah, it was really rough growing up, and they didn't understand me, and they don't get it, good vibes, right? So we do all of this, this whatever it is. That's what we're doing, right? And so we're doing all of this, and then we're just reacting, right? And then suddenly God matters, and I want to pass. I can get into med school, right? And then once I'm in, it's just like I don't know if he's really real. But we're living, reacting, doing whatever, right? And in that reacting whatever thing, which is one of my favorite California phrases, I'm so like whatever, is eventually you might hit crisis, right? Where a decision that you make suddenly has ramifications in reality, right? Where you're not living in your fictitious world that you pretend to be real, where suddenly it's like, no, now stuff is happening, right? So Moses killed. It's a big deal, right? So now it's just like, now I can't actually just do my thing. I can't, right? Do I join my so-called kinsmen? Do I join Pharaoh again? But I killed an Egyptian. I don't think I can go back to that, but I also don't think I can go back to that, right? And so this crisis is what made me like, I guess I'm gonna bounce, right? Now, it's in that context of that part of the narrative that suddenly Moses is going for a walk, and this is Moses is such a good example, I think, for modern culture in so many ways. Moses is out doing his thing, he's walking, and suddenly there's a bush that's on fire, which we sing about joyfully and and the bush was not consumed. And the fire is going and it's not burning, and he hears a voice calling out to Moses. And God saying, don't come too near, take off your shoes. You're in a place that's different. And he says, I am the God. He's giving him part of his identity back. I'm the God of your fathers. Right? Your fathers. I'm not the God of them people over there that you knew, like the fathers of the Israelites. He's like, yours. Right? He starts to reform for him his identity. Right? Of saying, yes, you do come from that. That is actually your narrative. Right? And it's a true one because I am, we'll get to the I am part, the God of that. Right? I'm legitimizing because you're interacting with me right now. Right? You're not reading a book about me. Right? You're talking to me, right? About it. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid. Then the Lord said, I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, etc. And now, behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me, and I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring forth my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. Now, here's a guy talking to a speaking bush. Okay? This is what we say in the Tazbihah when it says the rational or speaking bush, which makes no sense to you guys when you're singing. That's what we're talking about. Right? Of being like, this is this thing that shouldn't be speaking that speaks. And not, right? That utters. Right? The uttering bush. So you would think that when a voice that you haven't heard before is speaking clearly, and you're visibly seeing a phenomenon, and the person who's speaking with you is clearly able to identify you, right? And to identify real things in history, you might think, oh wow, supernatural and big and knows me, like show deference, right? But this is why I'm trying to bring in, I think this is the crisis of our time. What is Moses's locus of reference for seeing the world? Himself. Right? Instead of saying, God said, who I wasn't even sure who he was, and now I know who he was, and he's speaking, his response is like, oh wow, that's so nice of you. You noticed the oppression, you want to step in. It's like, no, but if I go to the sons of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has spoken, what is his name? What shall I say? It's like, really, your issue was, like, who to tell, like, what's his name? Right? It's like, here's my problem. Right? My problem is if I go to them, this. I'm not saying it's wrong to bring problems to God. I'm just saying is that this is the way we think when we're always focused on me, my thoughts, my opinions, my way of viewing. Right? It's like, what shall I tell them? And this answer is the core of all liturgical and religious being. Right? As he says, I am who I am. And it's so not full in English, because it just sounds like a statement of obvious. It's just like, great, he's who he is. But that's not what he's saying. He's saying, I'm the one who just is. I am, think of being, like the act of being. That's who I am. I am always be-ing. I am in the constant state of is, right? I'm ising all the time, right? And so it's like there's no English way of capturing it, right? So he's saying, but like outside of your terminology, you want a name, and he knows these people, they're gonna worship a name, which we did, right? Where it'll be like, it's not about my name, it's who I am, right? I am the one who simply always is. That's why I am in and know all things, because I just am. Right? So go back and say the one who is, right? He is the one who sends, right? Which, by the way, is one of the reasons why the Jews were very upset with the Lord when he kept on using that name for himself, right? Say this to them, that I'm the one who sent you. Tell them that I have sent you, and that is my name forever. Go and gather the elders. Say to them, the Lord has appeared to me, saying, I've observed you, etc. And give them this good news, like I'm coming in for the rescue, right? So he repeats it. And I'm going to do all of these wonders. I'm going to raise up a mighty sign. I'm going to work miracles, and everyone is going to know that I am the Lord, and I'm going to do a great work and deliver you. Moses answered, they're not going to believe me. They're not going to listen to my voice. They're going to say, no, he didn't, right? And so the Lord says, what's that in your hand? And he says, it's a rod. He goes, okay, stretch forth your rod. And he did, and became a serpent, and Moses fled, right? He's playing in the big leagues and not ready for it. And the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and take it by the tail. He did so, caught it, became a rod in his hand, right? So he did all of these things. Then, you know, the story, puts his hand in his bosom, it comes out leprous, puts it in again, comes out whole, right? So the Lord is even stooping down to Moses' level, being like, you want a magic trick? How to? Right? Like, you want a sign that this is real? How to? Right? I think because of the task that he's giving him, right? Like there was merit to that. But then you'd think that Moses, after the magic tricks, because some of you guys are like, if only I saw God and interacted with him, it's just not the same. You can't expect that of me. Well, Moses, after the 2 magic tricks, the Lord says to the Lord, oh my Lord, I'm not eloquent. Not so far, and not since you've spoken to your servant. I am a horrible public speaker. Right? It's like I don't think we can save your people because I don't have public speaking skills. Right? And the Lord says, I will speak, and I will put words in your mouth. And he says, nah. Can you send someone else? Right? So even though we tend to think, oh, if I interacted with the Lord, if the Lord spoke, if I did this and this and this, then I'd be good. Right? I'd be ready, I would do those things. No, you wouldn't. Right? And Moses is a big deal. Right? But this is a certain point in his life. Right? And then he's like, how about someone else? Right? And it says the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses and said, okay, Aaron, your brother, he speaks well. We'll use Aaron. Right? And here's God giving of himself, right? He's like, yo, I'm God, I am. And I said so, but he doesn't. Right? That's not what he does. And so I might leave the story, the narrative there, we'll see, I might come back to it. But I wanted to use that to frame it of saying that the spiritual struggle that people have is, though Moses messed up, he asked an incredibly important question. The right question he asked was, who are you? Right? That question was right. Because I think one of the biggest things that the spiritual struggle is about in terms of who God is that none of us tend to really ask that. You assume it. Right? Like, people will come in I'm like, how come God? I'm like, on what basis? And I'm not mad that you have emotions, but on what basis? How did you form your accusation? Right? Like, because you're asking a question, but you're not really, you're making an accusation. How come God sucks in this situation because, insert dilemma. Right? It's like, because God apparently did all of it. Right? So it becomes, how did you form that? What do you even know about him to decide that this is the right person to direct your accusation? Right? But what did you base it on? Who is he? Do you know a single thing about him? Right? Or is it all hearsay? If it's all hearsay to you, then you're forming it in ignorance, and then really reinforcing the ignorance, and then propagating it more, being like, yeah, they're so right. Right? Like, I was talking to someone yesterday, I talk about all the time, the problem of evil. Where it's like, okay, if God is omnipotent, if God is omniscient, if God is all powerful, if God is all good, how come, right? I'm like, that's a great question. Do you know anything about God? Because you chose 3 characteristics, right? And put them into one little thing, and then had all these conclusions that follow. And I'm like, we're not talking about an it, we're talking about a who. So if it's a who, then why does it end up in this consequence, right? Think about your siblings, warm feelings. where our parents didn't treat both siblings the same way. Right? Is that you could have the same scenario. No problems. I like saying these when he's not here. Where the beloved one was able to get away with many things, and others not, right? But even a parent might know what one person can handle and another not, right? Like sometimes there might be one kid, if you say you're wrong, there's a tantrum and we don't talk for 7 months, right? So the parent might be like, yell at the good one so that the other one gets it, like hears it, right? I'm not talking about right or wrong, but I mean, it's like they might do that, right? And then in another person do something differently, right? Or even think about like I know my bishop very well in the sermon, right? So somebody's like, yeah, I kept on going to Satan and bring up this and this and this, and like, you said it like that? Good luck. Right? Why? Because I know Satan, right? I'm like, no, don't come with your conclusion and accusation. Come with a question ready for discussion. He'll do it, right? That's him, right? Because we're talking about a who, not an it. It's not an object called bishop, or metropolitan in our case, right? And like, there's this thing called metro, so go to him, right? And then insert coin, and out comes this, which is how I think many of us deal with God, right? And so then we treat religion as a system, right? That it's supposed to be you throw in these inputs, and then you're supposed to get these outputs, and if that happens, everything is in order, right? And that's why you see so many religious devout people that are like so on cloud 9 until crisis, right? And then comes a crisis and being like, that is not the toy that's supposed to come out of the machine. This machine is a lie, right? Whereas like, that's your immediate conclusion. Or I'm like, what do you know about that? Is it even a machine? I mean, in this case it is, right? Or the shock on people's faces that gets me every time about people dying. I sound like the biggest jerk right now. I'm like, did you think they were gonna live forever? Right? But then it's always like, how could God do this? Like, your one guarantee in life is your death, right? Like, why is it shocking, right? Like, why is this the thing that we're all worked up about, right? I get that there's tragedy, but my point is like, we treat it as this thing that's not supposed to happen when it's the one guaranteed thing that will happen, right? And then comes, how could God do this? And I was like, what did you want him to do, right? What did he do? Did he kill him? How did you know? How did you find out? What made you think that God killed them? Is it because some tongue said God takes them at their best time? Did God take them? What does that mean? What's the story of that? Where did that phrase come from? Right? Because we forget narratives. So that expression might have a really deep, valuable meaning, being completely manipulated in a new social context, right? That suddenly gives it a new meaning, and then we use it to impose on God our social, cultural things, our personal limitations. I can't speak, I can't do that. I don't know what you're expecting from me. Moses says, I can't speak. I was like, I'm ready from God, I don't know how to do that religious, so this is my truth, whatever that means, right? So God is I am. And then the other thing about God that I think is part of the spiritual struggle for this age is God is immaterial. And for some reason that angers people, right? Where like everybody's mad that they can't touch and feel God. And it's like, you're just mad at who he is. He is immaterial. He isn't flesh. He humbled himself and took on flesh and entered history so that we can know him, right? He took on himself what's not his. Right? He took what is ours. Flesh is ours, material is ours. He's not that. We are that. Right? He took it on and said, so that you know. Right? So that you know that I am. Right? That's why he walked around saying, yeah, the one that you guys are kids of, Moses, the one who walked around, like the one who told you who I'm named, right? Because God said, tell them that I called myself this, and so always call me that, Yahweh. Right? And so that's why Jews today, they'll put a star and asterisk, so they won't utter the name, right? And so then in comes Christ saying, I am, ego eimi, right? That's why, for example, all the I am statements, for example, in the book of John, I am the bread of life, It's not even just saying I am, capital letters, which is how some Bibles do it. It's literally a reflexive in the Greek in which it's written of saying I, like pointing at himself, I, who is I am the light of the world. I, who is I am the bread of life. I, who is I am the true shepherd. Right? And this emphatic, no, I'm not messing up. Right? Even, for example, one of the readings from a couple of Sundays ago with the raising of the guy who's had good friends, like the cripple, right? Is that they're like, how dare you say I forgive sins? It's like, I'm making a point. Like, that's literally his answer to them. It's like, I'm making a point. Don't you think I could have said, be healed? I could have. I on purpose said, I forgive you. So that you know that I am. Right? But because he's immaterial and we are material, we end up really struggling because we're like, I don't know how to interact with that. Right? But then we're mad at him for his very existence. And that's messed up. Right? Because we're angry about the nature of his very being. It's like, I don't know how to help it. I am. That is me. Right? That is my actual self. That is my own osaya, my own substance, my own being, my own existence. Right? So I can't be something else. I can pretend if you like, but it's not who I am. And I don't pretend because I don't fake. Because lies don't work in me because I'm truth. Right? It's this identity thing. Right? The part that's missing to people, and this is where I think I'm trying to figure out what to do in talk 1 and what to do in part 2. It's like I'm really struggling, so forgive me, and if you're bored, I'm sorry. Is when Christ says, I'll give you real water, I'll give you real vision, I'll give you really bread, what he's saying to us is, if you become born of spirit, I will give you the things that are not yours right now by nature, by opening your eyes to see immaterial. But the way of seeing immaterial is a different way of seeing. Because you think about seeing only with your eyes. Right? And this is where I think so many of us get our crises. Because we're applying the way of seeing that we're familiar with on a whole other realm. Right? It's like the equivalent to me, like for example, I'm by trade a scientist, right? But I also think it can be very moronic when a scientist is trying to explain sociology, right? And one doesn't invalidate the other, right? It's a completely different way of seeing, right? They're not the same thing. One is just saying, what is this material? What is it made of? What are its properties? How can I quantify? How can I measure? How can I weigh? What can it do? What is its durability? What temperatures can it withstand? How can I apply this? What can it do? Right? It's a question of more of a what, right? And it is a way of seeing. And it is a way of seeing God too, right? Whereas the sociologist, the psychologist, the theologian, the philosopher, right? They're talking about something else. They're looking in the whys of things. Why is someone behaving like this, right? Or what is the meaning of this, right? But it's another way of seeing, right? And if one says, no, you're not seeing, on what basis do they say it, right? How do they know that one is seeing or not seeing? And so God is immaterial. It's something that you need to understand, right? And it is because he's immaterial that we're pursuing him both material and immaterially. Because he stooped to us to say, I know that's a struggle. So I'm giving you ways to incorporate the flesh because you're flesh. Right? There's God could have said, here's how you do Eucharist, right? Like, the priest stands up and goes, ta-da, you are communed. And God's God. It could happen. God's not bound to do it in bread and wine, right? He doesn't have to do that. Whereas no, I get it, you're sensual. You need to participate, right? Like, you need to physically be in it because otherwise it's just a thing, right? And look at all humans, even non-religious ones, we've all made rituals to express immaterial things. Whoever thought that a really good way to show affection is to say, let me clasp my skin against yours? I mean, that's what a hug is. Right? Let me see if I can reach around you, and this is a way of showing you I have affection. It's stupid. Right? Or like giving 5. It's actually dumb. Why does it indicate anything? Like, yeah, man. Those 5 digits touching, that's legit. Right? It's completely meaningless. As an action, it's stupid. Right? But it is reflecting something immaterial. Right? Ritual physicality is our way of expressing an invisible element of self that we all believe in. Right? And so it's doing something. Right? Even for coronations, putting their hands on somebody. Right? There's this sense of conference. Right? Knighting people. Right? Like, these are still practices, they might be antiquated to some extent, but they're still occurring, right? People make fun of how we dress, but I mean, you guys walked the aisle in your graduation wearing a dress that nobody wears anymore, right? In England, they still got people wearing really weird wigs, right? Maybe here too. But the point is that the immaterial is immaterial, and so if you're trying to make God conform to become himself always immaterial, you're gonna struggle. That's not going to be resolved, because you're trying to make God have an identity crisis and he doesn't have one, right? You do, which we'll talk about probably in lecture 2. He doesn't. He knows who he is, right? But part of our struggle is that once you've made that real connection that is immaterial, I think some lights might go on, right? Because then the world of the immaterial becomes less subjective than you might think. We're going to come back to that. But the beauty here is that God is not mad at us that we don't get it. Right? Like, God showed up to Moses, not the opposite. Right? Unlike St. Moses that we talked about today, who's like, hey, God, is that you? Right? Like this thing was asked, right? Which is a great question. God first manifested to Moses, right? And that's one of the reasons why I think Christians sadly undermine Christ. Like, I sometimes ask at random meetings, I'm like, so what does Christianity have going for it, different from other religions? And usually you get the really soft, like, touchy-feely stuff. Like, our God is so nice and he is so loving, and like it's just so nice that like he is this and we love each other, and he is just like my everything. It's like, cool, everyone could say that, right? And anyone can say that, so what's different, right? And everybody believes that about it, right? And it's very rare for somebody to say, well, actually we have a historical event that frames our whole narrative. I'm not saying there's no historical event in other religions, but I'm saying the immaterial world intersected with the material world in a way that's touchable, accessible, and I want to use the word verifiable, right? There's no really intelligent scholars on the planet right now, including atheists, that deny that there really was a Jesus Christ, right? The debate is about whether he is who he said he is, but not really about whether he came. Right? So if there really is this person that's saying, well, then I am rooting myself in reality if I believe his claim. I'm not talking about a fictitious person. I'm not talking about a hypothetical person. Right? But it's saying, okay, here's a person who really came, and that actually matters. Right? But this is to re-loop it to the top of this talk of saying, but you've divorced from the narrative. Right? So if you're divorced from the narrative, instead of being like, we are a collective of people who believe that this person who X number of years ago came in the flesh and claimed that he's God, really is God, and that he's still alive, and that's where I start from, everything else follows. Because sacraments, for example, are not random. Tenets are not random. Nothing is random. They're not arbitrary. Right? But once I divorce from that narrative, What do you reduce your religion to? And this is what you struggle with spiritually. Rules. Right? Then it becomes, I'm part of this club that claims to get saved, and that to get saved, I have to follow these step-by-step instructions that are not so easy anymore. But hey, there's some really cool stuff. Apparently, if you go and sit with a guy wearing a black dress and having a beard, you can get them erased. So do your thing, and then come in and get erased, and then we're good, we're solid. Right? I used to have this fantasy as a kid. I'm like, I hope I get martyred, because then I'm like guaranteed heaven. So I actually had this thing, like, we had a bunch of break-ins in a row at our dad's pharmacy. And so then I was like, there's guys with guns, I had a turn, my brother got a turn. But then I was like, you know what, if that ever happens again, I'm gonna be like, kill me because I'm a Christian. Even though like, they're there for the drugs. I'm like, no. I'm a Christian, right? And like, then I get my guaranteed ticket, right? But it was a sign of the mentality, right? Of being like, okay, that's what we do. Whereas it's just like, if this person is really who he says he is, then there's another person like, so like, why are you here? Right? Why did you come? Like, did you just come to chill? Right? What is the message of Christ? Why did he come? Right? That becomes a valid question. Right? Now, if you are who you said you are, what does that mean? Imagine if you lived your whole entire life and you know that you are adopted, and then suddenly in your mid-30s, you find out your biological father or mother or both. Right? That will, for most people, might not for everybody, lead to a questioning of identity. So who am I now in relationship to these people? What's the story? How did it happen that I'm here and they're not? Right? Suddenly, you're in that narrative that you either ignored or didn't even know. Right? It could be either. And so you're living your quote-unquote truth subjectively, reactively, and completely ignoring the reality of you have an objective identity. Right? There is an actual one, a real one. Right? And it's that frames everything. It's the why of everything. So you might have different hows throughout life, different whats throughout life, but there'll be only one why. Right? And there'll be only one goal, which we will get to maybe in the other talk. God reveals himself, right? And Moses did the right thing by saying, who are you? But the work that has to start to be done, I think we say most of this for the other talk, but the work that has to be done that I think is particular to this generation, it's not the only part of the work, but I think the biggest part of the generation is get over yourself, right? And I say that to me too, right? Where everything is about you, right? When you make everything about you in the wrong way, this is why everything is polar and a fight. This is why the only way in this society for anything to get done is who can yell the loudest, right? Like, that's what it's come down to, right? Who can, like, get the most on social media, right? Get people saying the right things, and then once everyone's parroting it, then you can silence the other voices while maintaining, this is democracy, this is your truth, do you, right? And we have 100 million songs about it. You're beautiful in every single way, except if you look like this and think like this, right? Why don't you be you and I'll be me, except for we're in the same room, in which case I would really rather you be me, right? Like, that's really more what we're doing, right? And we're not actually going back being like, so who are you, right? What are you? Is there a right? I think what I was going to go on next, I want to keep for the other part. I'm going to remove all the part about spiritual warfare about spiritual battle, about fighting for spiritual life, because I messed up big time on that. So that one we will skip, and I guess I'll give 10 minutes for any questions on that, because I'm using that first one to then talk about the kind of like what do you kind of do, right? Or how do I deal with this struggle about God? That'll be more geared in part 2. Unless there are no questions, which is great. Or comments. Or any of the fathers want to add anything? Or
Well, it's a good question, listen. So when you talked about like unfair treatment between brothers, is that why one of them turned to be married and the other one has?
100%. It affected the narrative. And my brother has a false narrative. Here.
Can you just recap like the 3 takeaway points?
Yeah, I think I wanted to stress, one of them I skipped, but I want to stress there's more than 3. Reclaim the narrative, like identify yourself in the context of more than yourself. Where do we come from? Who are we? Right? 2 is understanding that most people's spiritual struggle with God, I think, this is just my opinions, is not recognizing God as the I am, as identity, right? As being an actual objective existence, not an object, not a philosophy, not a morality, a being, a real existence. God as, like, subtopic under that, as immaterial, right? As being something to overcome. And what I skipped off of is God as Father. But I want to use those to say, okay, wrap your mind around those, because I think if you wrap your mind around those, it's not William Holmes says, here's what to do. It's more of, if you can wrap your mind around those and recognize that seeing immaterial is different than seeing physically, that might unlock the way you do spiritual struggle, right? And then that will lend to, I hope, lecture 2, if I don't get canceled.
Quick question. What do you say for us when I have a friend or friends that are not Christian and I love them and I'm struggling through my spirituality and trying to get closer to God. I believe in Lord Jesus Christ, but I have friends that I really love to but don't believe, and I want them to be saved. And they come to the Boon and say, well, how can you say the only way, the truth of life is Jesus Christ? What about them? Isn't that affect your spiritual struggle? What should I do when I'm faced with this in my spiritual struggle? This is a question I get asked quite a bit.
It may connect more to the second talk, but it's. I heard an atheist say this, and I really liked it. Right? Most of us, when we hear about like the charismatic Protestants that like used to knock on those doors, like, "Hey, are you saved?" Right? Or like, beware of hell. Right? Most of us get shy and embarrassed and be like, "Yeah, we don't do that. Like, that's distasteful." I heard this atheist on a talk once on CBC before it went psycho, where he was like, "Yeah, I had a Protestant friend who did that, and I loved him for it." And I was so taken aback. He was like, I was so impressed because it showed that he really believes in it. Because he really believes in it, that person had a real sense of urgency about me. Right? So he goes, so even though I disagree with how he views life, I don't believe in this existence, I very much respect that my friend cared so much about me that he violently and aggressively wanted me to not die. Right? And so that's when, like, I think I'm using that as the framing to say, it's to, again, remove it from a me issue to, is there a real truth? Right? Because it's like this whole my truth, your truth thing is like, I'm afraid of offending another truth. Right? Whereas if I view it as the truth, my subjective reality and their subjective reality is very irrelevant. Right? And so I won't have that same crisis. It'll be like, well, do I really believe that this is true? Right? And so if I really do, I shouldn't be afraid to say, this is what I know. Right? And so, like, to me, for example, I was like, well, are you trying to tell me that no one other than Christians, or specifically like Orthodox Christians, are going to heaven? Like, I have no idea. I know that the one who came in the flesh, named Christ, that's a real objective reality, a real existence, said, do this. That's why I'm doing it. Right? If he wants to do something else, it's his world, his rules, that's on him. Right? I can't speak to the mind of God that I can't fully fathom. But if he said, do this, this is why I'm insisting on doing it, and this is why I'm encouraging others to do it. But I think if I read it as truth, then there's an urgency to it, right? Because imagine if I, like look at today, global warming. It's heating up as a social topic, right? And so now this sense of urgency, right? That wasn't there 30 years ago. Right now it's just like, do you know the carbon footprint? I didn't even know that expression 20 years ago, right? That you're leaving by having this vehicle, right? Because they believe it's true, there's an urgency about it, and they don't care about what everyone else is thinking, to the extent that now those who don't believe in it are now seen as the weird ones, like the roles reversed, right? Whereas like, same thing with Christianity, when there was a compulsion of Christianity in the first 2 centuries, the 99.9% of the world that was not Christian became Christian because the urgency and reality of the Christian living, right? Then, when Christians lost conviction about it, divorcing the narrative, it inverted. No shock there, right? So I would say, like, at the beginning, like, do you know it to be true? Do you have conviction about it? Do you believe it to actually be true or hypothetically true? Because hypothetical, it's just a small dilemma for you. Yeah, it's sad, you know, we're just so lucky to be born in it. Too bad, so sad for them, right? Whereas if it was like, oh my gosh, they could die, that's them, right? Then it gives it a different urgency. So I think it would be a self-check.
You talked about like getting over yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So like how do you do that like practically? Like are you talking about like humility, like in a sense, or?
Actually, humility is a perfect answer. I don't think people understand humility, right? Because people treat humility as this like dramatic, like heap ashes on your head and like rent your clothes, and I am so filthy and I'm disgusting. I mean, you might be, but that's not what defines humility, right? Humility is a very simple concept. It's actually not an emotional thing at all. You can add whatever emotions you want to it. Like humility is and that's what the second lecture is about, so like we'll get there, is I'm the small I image, he's capital I image. When I stand in front of what I'm supposed to be, what is right and what is wrong is both. Humility is not even just negative, right? It's saying, okay, my arm is as it's supposed to be, but this one's not. This one has a big gashing cut that needs to be fixed. It's this objective recognition that I'm not as I'm meant to be in a healthy state. So yes, the answer is humility in the sense of stop grounding truth as being me, right? Like in any scenario being like, why, like pay attention, start off, here's a practical exercise, start paying attention to vocabulary when you start saying things like, obviously, clearly, definitely, absolutely, right? How many times do you say any of those words? Right? And it's like, I was listening to a podcast where I'm like, this guy said absolute at the beginning of every sentence, but I don't know if any of what he said were absolute truths. Right? But it's just like, we're using the language wrong. You're saying, and so why am I saying that? Is it absolutely true? Is it clear? Starting with humility even of speech, right? And then even having in your mind of being like, what am I assuming? I play that game a lot with like, especially with like high school, of being like, in Q&As, being like, don't get mad at me, but I'm gonna play a game where every question you ask, I'm gonna start with, what have you assumed in even the question you're asking? Right? Because then you're lowering yourself and being like, wait, I assumed to be right about, and I have no idea why I assumed that I was right. Right? Because I think once you start having that mindset, you immediately change. Right? Think about even conflicts. Forget even religion for a second. Think about conflicts, right? Think about somebody who's come at you being like, how dare you have done blah, blah, blah. And you're like, oh wow, that's not even what I meant. That's not even what I was thinking. But the person came rushing at you because they assumed it's what you meant and what you're doing, right? So it's saying, well, how often am I doing that about things and to others? I'm stepping back and saying, what's the true story here? Why did it get like this? And then it becomes normal, right? I joke with the Trump's wall thing, right? But that was like one of those things where I was doing this exercise, and everybody's like, oh, the wall, when Trump wanted to build the wall, I'm like, that's ridiculous. Because I try and practice this, I'm like, why? Forget what anyone thinks about Trump, I have no feelings, right? But just being like, why am I calling it ridiculous with such oomph, right? As though like I studied the immigration crisis of the United States of America. I know at which borders they're entering. I know what this costs. I've analyzed all the alternative plans, and I'm saying this is ridiculous. And I'm like, no, I just heard it on TV, and everyone made fun of it. I'm like, yeah, wall, right? But who knows anything about it, right? Like, is don't assume, right? Like, once you stop viewing yourself and your mind and your culture and your way as right, you can start opening up to everything. And a person who's doing that will arrive at truth. Like, seek truth, capital T truth, at all times. No matter where someone is in life, they will arrive at it. No matter where they are on the journey towards it, if that is this position, they will arrive. Like, that is a firm promise of God. And how we?
Yeah, you said something about get over yourself. But at the same time, people struggle to have identify the struggle. Like the crisis every person trying to figure out is inside struggles. But I want to add about there is a self-denial, right? Moses actually ran away. So there's a lot of occasions you try to avoid those problems and trying to run away. So what do you recommend for a person who's actually going through it?
Right. And I want to really clarify, because it's part of what Talk 2 is, when I'm saying get over yourself, I mean it in the wrong social sense, in the sense of making yourself the standard of truth, right? Of elevating the self to be a capital S as though you are the standard, right? Because you are in the image and likeness of God, actually you have a duty towards yourself, which is what some of the talks are about, right? Even Christ said, love others as you love yourself, right? Like he said it. So the key, which I don't want to get too into it, is going to be when I deal with myself, that I'm holding it against capital S self as it was designed. Because then I'll know how to deal with the self, right? Suddenly it won't be like dancing in the wind, right? Because even in Moses, in his proximity to God, in his wrestling with himself, the same Moses by the end of Exodus is the guy who's talking with God as a friend, right? Like he's no longer running, he's arguing, where he's like, if you don't forgive them, count me out, right? There's a transformation of self that happens in it, right? And so it becomes about, if I now know what myself is meant to be, how do I recover it, right? And that's where the various tools come in. That's maybe sounds like a vague answer for now, but where the tools kind of saying, all right, if part of me has fear, then I've got this muscle in myself that needs to be tweaked. Or it's like I have an injury here in this other thing of me. What are the treatments for this? How does it become as it was meant to be? Because as it was designed, it was whole and healthy, right? It got diseased. So then it becomes, what are the different healing measures? And that's the whole world of spiritual, right? Of being like, now what are the remedies to fix this immaterial aspect of self? Sorry, horrible answer, but it's because it is a part 2.
You touched on identity, and I know you like to use the health framework or concept. How does that help us better understand what our identity is?
That's Talk 2. I'll do it there, because I'm going to use a different one this time. Because Vancouver is sick of me. Go ahead. I don't know your name, I'm sorry. But hopefully you're wearing a name tag.
So when we mentioned humility, it kind of got me thinking, there's like a bit of a, I don't know, calling it a trend is right, but like I've seen kind of a boost in people on social media saying like it's important to be like really confident in yourself and, you know, I don't, kind of girl boss attitude. But like, what is the line between, you know, being confident in your abilities and like just in yourself and like being overconfident and having like an ego stuff?
So before even answering that, here's just for the exercise of how do I get out of myself, I would ask a question first. The people who are saying you should be more self-confident, regardless whether they're right or wrong, how do they know that people should be more self-confident?
I don't know, just seeing it around.
No, but that's my point, right? Not about you. What I mean is that everyone's proclaiming truths, right? And so it's just like, is this the right way to be because socially that's what we've become? Or is it objectively right? And that's something that is to first ask that. Always first asking, like, is this a true statement? Which is what talks to them, like, how do I know that it's true? Like, true against what? Right? And then it can follow what to do. Because what if they were like, no, here's what you need to do, is like, you need to, and that's something that's completely wrong. And then but your actual question becomes, okay, well, how do I balance that with this? When it's just like, you don't balance it because it's stupid, right? Right? Like, imagine somebody came up being like, no, you don't understand, you're supposed to wear helicopter wings on your hats, right? And it's like, well, how am I gonna balance that, like, with my wig? And it's like, what are we talking about, right? Like, who decided I have to wear these things, right? And what does that do with anything, right?
It just got me thinking, like,
Mm.
because generally, like, confidence is important to an extent, but I just thought, like, what is the boundary that we should set in confidence? Because, like, I think, you know, there is an extent that we should be confident in our abilities and stuff to work and to, you know, all of that, but, like, what is this, like, thing that we should set? That's kind of my question.
It's not a balance, it's an identity. Right? That's why I'm like, it's a wrong question. Not that you're answering the wrong question. I mean, and I really don't mean it as you. I'm using it as a teaching moment. You're not saying anything wrong, right? As much as to say, it's not about balancing. So to say I don't root the truth in myself, is saying that I didn't give myself my own identity. So what I do right isn't right because I did it. It's right because it's right, Or it's true because it's true. So I can be confident in truth. That's not a problem, right? There's nothing wrong with that. The mispractice of it, or the malpractice, would be if I start viewing myself as the standard of truth, right? So imagine if, like, the physician is proud of diagnosis as though they invented the diagnosis. They didn't. They arrived at something true. They're not the source of something true. They can be excited that they participated in it. They can be excited that they've excelled in it, that they've gone better at it, that they're expressing a gift, but they're viewed as a gift, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, right? And so what I'm saying is that it's about identity. Is that right being is a real thing. There is such a thing as a right way of being, right? Which is what I talked to you about. And that is why I'm not going to struggle about self-confidence, or that's why in a virtue language, egotism and self-hatred in Christian life are both sins of the ego. They're both sins, right? There's one that's the far right, where we say right-hand wars, the excess, right? And then the left-hand war is the going against it, the deficit or the not doing right? And so like both would actually be seen as wrong based on what? What is a proper ego, right? That's where something. It won't be about balancing. So, but to me, to get to what I know you actually meant, or I suppose you actually meant, would be to say, what am I rooting my confidence in? Is how to get at it quickly, right? For example, I was accused once of speaking overly confidently, and I'm like, okay, point taken, like objectively. And I start paying attention to how I speak, and I'm like, I think it's usually when I know something to be a fact. Once I don't know it's a fact, my language changes. Like, it turns into I suppose, I think, I don't even know, right? Like, I'm not comfortable with that. Whereas if something is a fact, right, then it's different. Because to me, I'm like, all right, I'm gonna be careful not to offend my neighbor with my speech, so point taken, right? But my self-examination is like, am I being egotistical, which I'll review with my own spiritual guide, or being like, I don't think I was. I think to me it was like, oh no, this isn't, I'm not confident because it's me. It's because it's a fact, right? So it's about rooting yourself in capital T truth, right? That'll help you navigate that, I think.
Rona, there is a lovely quote by C.S. Lewis about humility and the self. He says that humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. So basically, you don't focus everything around you, as your Reverend said, but it is actually to allow, firstly, God and others to be part of your life. Sometimes we go back to St. Antony, who said that you better know yourself in order for yourself to know God. So we are not asking anybody to completely ignore and deny and bury yourself, but it is to just become less self-centered, I guess.
wanted to share a thought about what you said regarding Moses' interaction with God and how his first question was to really ask about God's identity. That was his main concern. Well, at least aside from whenever he was concerned about how to actually introduce him. But it reminded me of Paul whenever he was on the road to Damascus, and Christ criticizes what he's doing because he's persecuting him, right? And so naturally you would suppose that your response would be, okay, well, what do you want me to do? Like, if you think this is wrong, well, what's right? Like, what should I do? But his first question is, who are you? And then he says, what do you want me to do? So I just love that because it frames the proper perspective for us to understand God, and from that flows the right way to live.